The arena was filled with noise, as thousands of alien voices screamed and shouted and roared with excitement, as if something great was about to happen, and in the center of the dust-covered ring stood a figure that did not belong, a human covered in blood and bruises and dirt, with one eye swollen shut, and one leg barely able to support his weight, and his name was Jace. And he had once been a proud soldier from Earth, but now he was just a broken man thrown into a game that no human had ever won before. Above him on the high seats, the aliens laughed and waved credit chips in the air, placing bets on how fast he would fall, and how ugly his defeat would be. And some even mocked him by imitating human screams and pain, and then someone raised a hand and made an offer that silenced even the loudest voices in the crowd. And that offer was not money or weapons, but something different, something cruel, I wager. The girl said, the alien dressed in red armor with black eyes and sharp, silver teeth, and he pointed to the cage beside him, where a young alien girl sat chained and quiet, and she had glowing violet eyes and skin like polished stone, and her hair flowed like silver rivers down her back, and she was known only as real. And the moment her name was spoken, she looked up with shock and fear, and a tiny flicker of hope. Some aliens gasped, while others clapped at the bold gamble, and the announcer laughed into the mic and shouted that the human now had something to fight for. And Jace looked up slowly, his body broken, his mind foggy, but when he saw her, he remembered a night from not long ago, when she had risked her safety to bring him water and patch his wounds in secret. She had whispered words to him back then, saying he didn't deserve this, saying he had a strong heart, and even if he died he should die with pride. And now she was the prize, the reward, the gamble. And her eyes found his, and locked there, as if sending a silent message across the ring. And though his limbs trembled, and pain burned through every inch of his body, Jace clenched his fists. He was not going to let them take her like that. Not while he could still breathe. Not while he could still stand and fight. And even if his chances were low, even if every alien around him believed he would die in the dirt, he knew one thing for certain: he had to try. The bell rang loud and sharp like thunder, cracking through steel, and the gate across the arena opened, and from it came a creature that towered over Jace, with forearms thick like tree trunks and teeth that dripped green slime, and its roar made the ground shake and the crowd cheer even louder. The fight began with no warning, no rules, just violence and rage, and the beast charged forward, slamming into Jace with the force of a falling ship, sending him flying across the sand and hitting the wall hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. But somehow he rolled over and got up again, face bleeding, ribs cracking, but eyes burning each time the beast swung. Jace dodged just a little slower each time his muscles screamed, but he kept moving, and in the crowd some aliens began to watch in silence, unsure how he was still standing, how he had not given up. And in the cage, Relaxa pressed her face against the bars, whispering his name, even though he could not hear her voice through the noise and metal. Jace's heart pounded louder than the crowd, louder than the pain, louder than the fear, and he saw a loose stone on the ground, sharp and small, and he grabbed it quickly, holding it like a dagger. And when the beast came close again, he ducked under its strike and stabbed it into the soft flesh behind its knee, making it roar and stumble. It was not enough to kill it, not even close, but it made the crowd gasp, and Relex's eyes widened, and for the first time Jace saw something in the beast's eyes. Something like surprise, and maybe even respect. And in that moment Jace stood straight, breathing hard, bleeding badly, but alive and strong in spirit. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a message to every being in the arena, to everyone who thought humans were weak, to everyone who thought kindness and loyalty were useless things. And to Relexa most of all, the girl they tried to gamble away, as if she was nothing. Jace did not speak a word, but his body said everything, and though pain wrapped around his chest like chains, he stepped forward again, ready for the next blow, ready to keep fighting, ready to protect the one soul who ever looked at him not as a weapon or a slave, but as something more. And in that cruel pit of dust and blood, a new story began, one that no one in the arena was ready for, one that would not end the way they all thought it would, because Jace was not done. Not yet, not while she still believed in him. Not while there was still breath in his lungs and fire in his heart. Jace stood in the center of the ring, with blood dripping from his mouth and his shoulders trembling under the weight of pain and pressure, and yet his eyes stayed locked on the girl in the cage across the sand, as if her gaze alone held his body upright and steady, like a shield of light in a world made of shadows and chains. And he remembered her face from days ago, when she knelt beside him in the slave barracks, offering a soaked cloth and a silent look that said, "I do not care where you are from, you do not deserve this back." Then she had no name, at least none that he knew, and she moved like a ghost through the prison shadows, helping the sick, speaking to no one, touching no one, until him, and even then, she said only a few words, before slipping back into the dark, where guards could not see her and punish her. And now she sat like a prize on display, as aliens placed cruel bets on her fate, and his blood. Her name was Relexa. And that name now echoed through the crowd, like music twisted into a weapon, as Venkar repeated it, with a wicked grin, shouting again that she was part of the wager, and that the human was free to win or die trying. And every eye turned back to Jace as the announcer raised his claw and shouted for the match to continue, and the beast to rise again. The four-armed monster pulled itself upright with one leg limping where Jace had struck it, and its eyes burned with rage and humiliation as it charged again, this time swinging wide to knock Jace from his feet and end the fight fast. But Jace dropped low and rolled away across the sand on his side, screamed from broken ribs, but he pushed up again, lifting his fists with teeth clenched and mind racing. He had no plan, only instinct, only pain and memory, and the image of Relexa watching from her prison with hands wrapped tightly around the bars, and her breath caught in her throat, and her heart beating faster with every swing and slam of the monster's limbs. And Jace could barely think through the roar in his head. But he saw a chain in the dirt part of an old post ripped from the wall, and when the beast rushed again he dived and grabbed it, twisting the chain around its leg, as the crowd gasped, and the creature stumbled. Relexa rose in her cage, unable to sit still, and her guards reached for her, but she did not care, and she shouted his name for the first time, her voice ringing over the noise like wind through fire. And Jace heard it, even through blood and chaos, and it lit something in him that the aliens had not destroyed, something sharp and human and bright. With all his strength, Jace yanked the chain and pulled the beast down, and then he leaped on its back, pounding fists into the soft space behind its skull, over and over, while the crowd screamed for blood, and Relexa screamed for him to stop before they killed him. And the monster flailed and roared, and finally collapsed under its own weight. Jace rolled off gasping for air, covered in blood and dust and sweat, and his hands shook as he looked toward the cage, and saw Relexa crying, not with fear but with something else, something like hope or disbelief or maybe pride. And the announcer roared that the human had survived, and that the game was not yet over. Guards entered the ring, dragging the beast away and lifting Jace to his knees, and the rich alien Venkar stepped down from the platform, slowly walking toward the ring with a strange grin on his face and a new glint in his black eyes, and he clapped slowly as he approached, like a predator praising prey that had bitten back, and he spoke in a calm voice that echoed through the arena. "One win means nothing," he said. "If you want the girl, you fight again, and only then do you walk away with her freedom and your own." And Jace looked up with blood on his face and fists still clenched, and he asked in a voice like broken stone and fire and rage, "Do I have your word?" And Venkar smiled wider, saying, "You have my word, as a noble of the High House." And every alien around knew what that meant. Face fell with worry, and the guards pulled Jace to his feet, dragging him toward the gates, and past her cage, and for a brief second, their hands touched through the bars, and she whispered something he could barely hear, something soft and strange, and full of warmth, like, "I will not let you fall, not again, not alone." That night they threw Jace into a cold cell with blood on the floor and chains on the wall, and yet somehow Relexa found her way there, under the cover of dark, carrying stolen herbs and clean water and silence. And when she knelt beside him again, he looked at her and said, "I should have stayed down." And she answered, "You stood because you remembered me." And, as the stars passed above them, outside that prison of pain and shadows, a bond grew stronger than chains and deeper than fear, and they both knew the games were only beginning, and the real battle was still to come, and neither of them would face it alone again. The sky above the arena turned darker as heavy clouds moved in, hiding the twin suns behind walls of gray and red, and casting long shadows across the sand where blood still soaked the ground from the last fight, and where Jace now lay curled in a cold prison cell with bruises covering his chest and arms and a deep cut running down his back, and yet his eyes stayed open, burning with the memory of her voice and her touch, and the promise they shared in the dark. Relexa sat on the other side of the bars, her hands glowing faintly with the healing herbs she had brought, and her face pale from fear and exhaustion, but still calm, still strong, and her eyes never left his face as she whispered the names of stars in her own language, one by one, like a quiet lullaby meant to ease pain, and remind them both that beauty still lived somewhere far from here. Outside the prison, the aliens were buzzing with new bets and wild guesses, as news of the humans spread faster than fire through dry lives, and more came to watch the next match to see if the bleeding stranger could really do it again, or if he would finally die like they expected him to from the beginning. And this time Venkar raised the stakes even higher, offering a full crate of crystals, and a second slave. If Jace lost, but Jace was not thinking of prizes, or pain, or death. He was thinking of the way. Relaxa looked at him as if he mattered, as if every punch he threw, and every drop of blood he spilled, meant something more than just survival. And when the guards opened the door and dragged him out into the harsh light again, he did not resist, and he did not beg. The announcer roared louder than before, his voice shaking the walls, as he shouted that this time the fight would be different. This time, the human would face not one but two enemies. Both stronger, both faster, both trained for war, and the crowd howled with joy as Jace was shoved into the ring, again chest heaving, and knees barely holding. The first enemy was tall, and lean with claws like knives, and eyes like fire, and the second was smaller, but moved like a blur across the sand. Both circling Jace with grins full of teeth and murder, and in the corner of the arena, Relaxa watched with fists clenched and lips pressed tight as she passed a small stone to a worker dressed in gray, who nodded and disappeared through a hidden HFY. Did not wait for them to strike, he lunged at the faster one, grabbing its arm and slamming his elbow into the soft joint, just as the other came from behind, and raked claws across his back, sending him to the ground with a cry and a splash of blood. But he rolled fast, grabbing a chunk of metal from the ground and slashing upward into the leg of the taller one before kicking it away. The crowd roared louder than ever, some now cheering for him, while others screamed for his head. And in the noise, Jace found something strange, like fuel pouring into his chest, a heat that pushed back the pain and sharpened his thoughts, and it came from her, from Relaxa, who had never looked away, not even for a second. He rose again, spitting blood and moving like a shadow, refusing to fall as he struck the small one in the throat and ducked under the next blow, and then turned fast and slammed his knee into the face of the taller enemy again and again, until both lay in the sand, groaning and broken, and the arena fell into silence. Venkar stood slowly on the platform, his smile now tight and cold, as he clapped once, then twice, then motioned for the guards to step forward. But before they could reach Jace, the worker in gray returned and slipped something small into Relaxa's hand, a folded message with a symbol burned into it, and her breath caught as she read it. The message said, "Help is near," and the symbol was one she had not seen since she was a child, the mark of her family. The royal bloodline, thought dead and forgotten, and her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of something older, something deeper, something that felt like a rising storm after years of silence. She looked at Jace, now barely standing, and smiled through the bars, whispering a word that meant hope in her tongue, and he saw her lips move and nodded back with a look that said, "I am still here, and I am not done, and I will keep fighting, not for glory, not for pride, but for you." As the guards dragged him back through the gates, and the crowd erupted once more, the shadows in the arena grew longer and colder. But in that growing darkness, a spark had been lit, and it was burning brighter with every breath he took and every step she made toward a truth. The galaxy had tried to bury And, though his bones were cracked and his body screamed for rest, Jason's eyes still burned like fire in the night, never blinking, never doubting that something greater was waiting just beyond the next fight, the next breath, the next sunrise. The crowd was louder than ever, stomping the ground and slamming fists against the rails of the arena, as the gate slammed shut behind Jace, whose body sagged from exhaustion and wounds, yet whose spirit burned even brighter than before, and in the highest seat above all others, Venkar stood with a face like carved stone, while guards flanked him on both sides, and behind him the cage, where Relaxa waited, was now surrounded by more soldiers than before her. Eyes followed Jace, as he dropped to one knee inside the holding pen, blood running down his arm and across his chest as the Medrones ignored him, and the crowd screamed for another fight. One more round, one more show of pain, and rage, and blood, to feed their hunger, and Venkar raised a hand, and spoke with a voice like oil and iron, "And lies the human will. Rest for one cycle, then he fights again," he said, "and if he survives, I will grant him one final match, and if he wins that, I will honor my wager and release the girl and myself from all claims." And his voice was calm and smooth, but Relaxa knew something was wrong, something hidden beneath the words like poison in sweet water. That night, Jace was thrown into a cold room far from the cells he had known before, a place with no windows and only one exit guarded by machines with glowing red eyes, and when the door closed, he lay down in the silence, listening to the beating of his heart and the memory of her voice, and wondering what came next. In another room, Relaxa sat in chains, her wrists bound with metal laced with neural locks, and her eyes closed as she listened to the guards whisper of Venkar's plan, to keep her no matter what, to use her no matter who won or lost, because she was not just a slave, she was something more, something ancient, something powerful and hidden, even from Her self-anchor stepped into the room then with a long cloak dragging behind him, and eyes like cold stars, and he spoke not with anger, but with curiosity, asking if she had told the human the truth, if she remembered what she really was, and what she could do if unlocked, and she said nothing, staring straight ahead, with her breath slow and steady. He leaned close and whispered that he had found the seal that kept her power buried, and that if she tried to run, he would break it and use her as a battery to power his war machines across the stars. And she finally looked at him with eyes that glowed faintly like stars trapped in glass, and said one word softly. Noja sat in his cell, unaware of the storm rising around him, his body sore, his hands swollen, his thoughts caught between memory and silence. And then the door slid open, and a figure entered, not a guard, not a soldier, but an old alien dressed in gray, with skin like bark, and eyes like deep water, and he knelt beside Jace, without a word, and pressed something into his hand. Kith was a piece of crystal carved with a symbol he had seen once on Raylex's wrist, a mark hidden beneath bracelets and sleeves, and pain in the old alien spoke with a voice like wind through trees, saying, "She is not just a girl, she is the last of her kind, and you were chosen not by chance, but by fate." Before Jace could speak, the figure was gone, like smoke in the wind, and the door slammed shut, again leaving him with the crystal and a question that burned through his thoughts like fire through dry grass. And when the morning came, and the guards dragged him into the arena again, he did not resist, and he did not speak this time. The crowd was different, quieter, more focused, as if something had shifted in the air, and on the far end of the arena stood a figure in armor with a helmet hiding his face, and a long weapon strapped to his back. And when the announcer shouted the name of the challenger, the crowd gasped as one, and Raylex's heart stopped in her chest. The enemy was human, not just human, but a soldier from Earth, captured long ago and turned into something else. Something built for war, with metal in his spine, and circuits in his veins, and eyes that did not blink. And Jace looked at him, and saw a mirror twisted by cruelty and pain, and he knew this fight was not just survival, it was a message. Carr smiled from above his trap, now complete, his plan unfolding with perfect precision, and he shouted that the match would not end until one human fell and the other stood victorious, and the girl's fate would follow the blood. Ralexa stood in her cage, hands clenched and eyes glowing faintly, as the guards around her looked nervous, and the chains on her wrists began to hum with soft blue light, and she whispered a promise to herself and to the stars that no matter what happened next, she would not be silent, she would not be powerless, and she would not let him fall. The fight began with a flash of light and a roar from the crowd, and two humans charged toward each other across the sand, with every eye watching and every heart pounding, because what came next would decide not just who won, but who truly mattered in a world that bet on pain and profit and power above all else. The sand crunched beneath Jace's boots as he moved in a slow circle facing the other human, whose armor hissed with hidden machines, and whose steps made no sound at all, like a ghost from Earth's forgotten wars. And the two men did not speak, did not blink, did not lower their guard, because they both knew what this was: not just a fight, but a test of will, of identity, of memory. High above the arena, Venkar watched with narrowed eyes and a smile that held no joy, only hunger for control and power and chaos. And Ralexa stood behind her cage bars, trembling not with fear, but with something deeper, something older that she could not explain. As energy curled beneath her skin, like rising fire, and the chains on her wrists began to crackle with blue sparks, Jace blocked the first strike, barely dodging the second, rolling under the third, and lashing out with a sharp kick that sent the armored figure staggering back for a moment. And he saw something strange in those cold metal eyes, something like hesitation, something almost human, and he wondered if the soldier inside still remembered what it meant to feel. Each blow was heavier each moment, slower each breath, harder as their bodies collided again and again, fists slamming metal against flesh, and pain blooming like fire through every nerve. And still neither gave in, neither fell, and the crowd began to change their cheers, growing confused, uncertain, unsure who they wanted to win, and watched every move, every hit, and their hands tightened around the bars as the chain sparked brighter, and her breath quickened, and memories rose like storms behind her eyes. Memories of voices calling her name, and hands guiding her through glowing halls, and a promise whispered in her ear when she was small, that one day someone would come, not to save her, but to stand beside her. Just caught the soldier's wrist, twisted hard, and slammed his elbow into the joint, hearing a crack and a grunt, not from the machine, but from the man inside, and he froze for a moment, eyes wide, as the armored figure stepped back and pulled off the helmet, revealing a face, half human, half metal, and filled with sorrow. "I know you," the soldier said, voice rough and shaking. "You were at Outpost 9. You carried me when the ship crashed and left me to die." And Jace nodded slowly. "Memories flooding back of smoke and screams, and pulling bodies from the wreckage and trying to save one more life before the sky turned black. You were alive, Jace whispered, and the other man smiled a broken smile. I was, and they turned me into this, but I remember. I remember who you are and what you did, and I don't want to fight you. And the crowd went silent as the two men stood face to face, bloodied and bruised and breathing hard. Car's voice cracked through the arena like thunder. Finish him or lose the girl, and the crowd gasped and turned as the ground shook, not from weapons but from power rising from the cage where Alexa stood, her chains now glowing like fire, and her body wrapped in soft light that pulsed with every heartbeat. She stepped forward, shattering the restraints with a flash of energy, and raised her hand toward the arena, her voice ringing out like music carved in stone. Enough, she cried. This ends now. And the guards around her fell back stunned and afraid as her power grew brighter, rising like a storm, breaking free for the first time in years. Jace looked at the soldier, who nodded once and stepped aside, and then turned to face the platform where Venkar stood, no longer smiling, and now shouting orders to his guards, and reaching for a weapon hidden in his cloak. And Alexa raised both hands, eyes glowing with starlight, and released a wave of force that shattered the barriers between them. Explosions rocked the stands as rebels hidden among the crowd revealed their weapons, their symbols marked with the same crest as the crystal Jace still carried, and they began to fight back against the guards, freeing prisoners and tearing down the banners of Venkar's house. As chaos spread like wildfire, Jiz ran to Alexa, catching her as she stumbled from the drain of power, and she looked up at him with eyes soft and shiny and said, "You came back," and he smiled through cracked lips. "I never left." And in that moment, in the center of all the fire and shouting and noise, they found silence in each other. She leaned against him, her warmth not from power, but from trust, and the bond they built through pain and blood and silence, and his arm wrapped around her as she whispered, "I am not a slave, I am not a weapon. I am Alexa, daughter of the lost line, and you are not alone." The soldier joined them, weapon raised, watching their backs as the rebels pushed forward, and the gates to the arena broke open for the first time in years, letting the light from the outer world pour in, and Jace stood with her beside him, breathing hard but standing strong and ready for whatever came next. They had not planned for this, had not asked for this, but together they had changed everything. And as the wind blew across the broken arena, the warmth of trust between them burned brighter than any weapon ever could. The wind howled through the shattered arena gates as smoke curled into the sky, and screams of panic mixed with battle cries, while prisoners ran free and guards scrambled to regain control. And in the heart of it all stood Jace, holding Alexa close as the dust of broken chains and fallen banners swirled around them like a storm made from the past and from promises broken and kept. She leaned into him, not from weakness but from release, as her powers flickered and sparked around her like gentle lightning, as if the very air responded to her emotions and memories and pain and pride. And Jace could feel it, not just in his arms but in his bones, that this girl he fought for was not just rare, not just important, but something the galaxy had tried to bury and failed. Looked up at the broken tower where Venkar once ruled with lies and greed, and she whispered words from her language, words Jace could not understand, but felt deep in his chest like the rumble before a quake. And she stepped forward as her feet stirred the dust, her eyes glowing like stars lost in twilight. Rebel fighter rushed to them, holding a strange device, a small sphere etched with the crest Jace had seen before, and the rebel bowed low and called her by a name that had not been spoken in public for many cycles. "My lady, your father's seal has been found, and with it your command." Alexa froze, as if the word struck her harder than any chain ever had. And she touched the sphere, and closed her eyes as visions flashed through her mind. She saw a city made of light and glass, a throne room where her father once stood tall and proud, a hidden escape route where loyal guards carried her away as the betrayal began, and above it all, the face of Venkar twisted with envy and rage as he ordered her family erased from history, and turned her from royalty to a prize, and from a daughter to a slaver. Rebels had waited for this moment, waited for her power to awaken, waited for the sign, and now they looked to her not just as a symbol, but as a leader. And she turned to Jace, her hands trembling, and said, "I was never meant to be a weapon. I was meant to protect, to heal, to guide, and they took that from me, and now I must choose what to do with what's left." Jace touched her hand gently and said, "Then choose with your heart, and I'll walk beside you wherever that path goes." And in that moment, something shifted inside her, as if the years of silence and fear had melted under the warmth of his words, and she stood taller, stronger, and ready. They moved through the ruins as the rebels pushed deeper into the stronghold, freeing more prisoners, recovering stolen tech, and gathering the lost and the wounded. And at the far edge of the fortress they found what Veng had hidden deep below in chambers of steel and shadow and cruel design. It was a chamber filled with sealed capsules, each one holding a figure floating in stasis, alien children, soldiers, elders, all marked with the same crest, Relaxa, now war, and each one, a victim of Venkar's experiments to drain power from rare bloodlines and turn life into fuel for his machinist. Relaxa fell to her knees as tears ran down her face, and Jace stood beside her in silence, not needing to speak, not needing to ask, because the truth was there, in the faces behind the glass, the truth of her stolen people, and the secret that had been buried in darkness. She touched the control panel, and light filled the room, as the capsules began to hum, and the systems slowly returned to life, and she whispered, "I will not let them stay frozen in fear, as I will break the cycle." And Jace reached out and placed her hand in his, and said, "We break it." Together behind them, the metal doors hissed, and the soldier they once fought stepped into the light, carrying supplies, and looking less like a weapon, and more like a man, and he said, "There are still battles ahead." Venkar escaped with his inner guard, but the tides have turned, and word is spreading across. The systems in other houses will now rise either to support her, or to destroy her. Alexa stood in the center of the chamber, glowing softly with every breath, as her people slowly awakened from sleep, and her voice rang with quiet power, saying, "Let them come. If they bring war, we answer with unity. If they bring doubt, we answer with truth. And if they bring pain, we answer with healing and strengthened." Jace watched her, not as a savior or a soldier, but as a man who believed in something more than winning, who believed in standing up even when broken in, choosing right even when outnumbered, and he knew that what began in a cage with blood and silence had now become something bigger than both of them. As the freed people opened their eyes and stepped into the light, and the rebels gathered around the last royal of a forgotten line, Relaxa reached for the symbol that marked her place in the galaxy, and held it high, and the room answered not with cheers or shouts, but with silence that spoke louder than any words. The stars above the ruined arena blinked in silence, as smoke drifted over the broken towers, and the banners of House Venkar lay torn in the sand, while rebels secured the last gates, and prisoners gathered with wide eyes and uncertain hearts. And in the center of it all, Relaxa stood wrapped in robes of silver, and marked with the crest of her people, once hidden now shining bright. Against her chest, Jace stood beside her, dressed in worn armor stained by every fight, every fall, every choice. And though his wounds had not fully healed, and his steps were still heavy, his eyes burned with the same fire that first rose in him, when they tried to wager her life, like it meant nothing, and he knew now without question that the game was never about the fight, it was always about what he refused to lose. Across the desert beyond the fortress walls, Venkar's ship lay hidden inside a canyon, his guards watching the skies while their master paced the deck with fury in his eyes and fear in his heart, because he had made a mistake. He had played too hard, gambled too far, and underestimated the one thing no alien ruler ever understood about humans: they do not fight for gold, they do not fight for power, they fight for each other, and that makes them dangerous. A signal lit up on his console, showing rebels closing in from every direction, and another signal followed, carrying a message not of surrender, but of return, and the face on the screen was hers no longer, the quiet slave girl, but the leader, the light, the fury of a fallen line reborn, and she spoke with calm words and clear eyes. "I offer no revenge, only justice," she said. "Return the ones you took or face what comes." And Venkar snarled and shut the screen with a scream, as he barked orders to prepare his last line of defense, unaware that his hunters were already back inside the stronghold. Relaxa turned to Jace and placed a small device in his palm, shaped like a stone but warm to the touch, and pulsing with light, and she said, "This is your key to me, not as royalty, not as power, but as the one who would have remained in chains had you not stood." And he held it tight, not for glory, not for reward, but because her trust meant more than anything the galaxy could offer. The soldier, who once fought Jace, now stood in full rebel colors, leading a squad of former slaves and prisoners, armed with weapons once meant to control them. And he spoke, quickly saying, "The last vault is near the shipyard, and if we take it, we cut off Venkar's escape, and end this without more blood." Relaxa nodded and lifted her hand, the mark on her palm glowing like a small sun, and she said, "Then we go together, not as pawns, not as prisoners, but as people who choose their own names and write their own stories." And the rebels shouted back with voices that shook the walls as they marched into the night. The canyon was dark and narrow, filled with ancient stone and hidden guns and traps, but the rebels moved like one. And when the gate opened and the fire began, Jace and the soldier pushed forward together, breaking the lines with strength and memory and unity, and above them, Relaxa walked through the chaos, untouched, her power shielding the wounded and pushing back the flames like wind through dust. They reached the ship and burst into the command room, where Venkar stood with wild eyes and a trembling weapon, shouting, "You are nothing without the cage, you are nothing without the chain," and Ralexa stepped forward with her hands raised and her voice clear. "You bet everything, and now you regret the one thing you never understood, loyalty." And Venkar fired, but the weapon failed, as the ship systems turned against him, hacked by the rebels he once enslaved. And his guards fell back as the people he thought broken now stood with heads high and eyes full of light. Jace stepped beside her, weapon lowered, voice firm, and said, "You gambled on my death and staked her life as a prize, but I never played your game. I made my own, and she was never yours to give in." Carr was taken without mercy, but without cruelty, bound by his own chains, and dragged from the bridge as the rebels cheered, and the stars above the canyon seemed to glow brighter than before, as if the sky itself had waited for this moment for the bet to break, and the story. And Ralexa stood in the shipyard, wind blowing her hair, and looked out across the galaxy that once turned its back on her, and now looked again with wonder and fear and hope. And she turned to Jace and asked, "What now?" And he smiled with tired eyes, and said, "Now we show them who we are, not with weapons, but with will." And as the ship rose into the sky, carrying not slaves, not soldiers, but survivors and leaders and friends, the crowd below raised their hands, not in worship, but in respect, because they knew something rare had happened, something worth remembering. Human walked into the jaws of death, and came back not with gold or titles, but with a promise kept and a chain broken, and an alien girl once gambled away now soared beside him, not as a prize, but as a queen who chose to be more. Rand. The galaxy would never forget the day the bet was broken by the one no one believed would stand.